So next speaker is Benedikt Diemer on atomic to molecular transition in cosmological simulations.
Thanks. Is the level good, audio-wise? Well, thanks for having me here. I would like to talk about some work that I've been doing with people at the CFA, in Germany, in Australia. And I guess just from the collaboration, you can probably guess which cosmological simulation I'm going to talk about. It is, of course, illustrious. By cosmological, I mean 100 megaparsec boxes up to sort of a few hundred megaparsecs. Coming up. So this is actually, the video is illustrious, but I will be talking about TNG. Good distinction. Now, we've already heard the usual slurs against these simulations, like that they're just expensive semi-analytical models and whatnot. Now, I think when you look at these movies, you see that's not quite justified. It is a simulation, but it's true. There's a lot of stuff that we've put in by hand, a lot of models that give us all these beautiful, explosions and all that. And so we have to be careful when interpreting these simulations because not everything is a genuine prediction. Now, today, I am going to talk about a very ambitious way to post-process these simulations. Namely, I want to split this gas up here into atomic and molecular, neutral and ionized hydrogen. Now, you may think that these simulations are not ready for that yet, and we'll come to this question. One thing I will pose to you, though, is that I think there have been way more than 500 papers on Eagle and illustrious alone. And so whatever you think people shouldn't be doing, they're already doing it. And I think the bar we have to clear is to do things as well as we can right now. And so I hope you will take this talk in that spirit. Now, because these simulations are heavily parameterized, we have to be careful to compare them to observations. And the way this has been done largely has been in stellar properties. So stellar mass functions, colors, all these good things. But why not gas? I mean, we have more and more gas observations like beautiful spirals in the local universe in atomic and molecular gas. But the simulation does not give us these quantities. It only gives us hydrogen density. Now, why is that? Well, it's because it's really complicated. It's actually for two reasons. So first, when you send a parcel of molecular hydrogen out into the universe, what happens? Well, it gets immediately dissociated by Lyman-Werner band UV photons from young stars. That means you need a shielding layer of H1 around your hydrogen, and it typically forms at very high densities in GMCs where the H2 can recombine on dust grains. And then, of course, these clouds, they will form their own stars, they will emit their own UV light and blow the cloud apart. So to really simulate all of this, we'd need UV radiative transfer, we'd need dust modeling, chemical network, and most importantly, perhaps, insanely high spatial resolution. Right? And we have none of these things in simulations like illustrious. But I think that also means the problem is a little more general, right? It doesn't just apply to these cosmosims, because there are many, many simulations that won't have all of this. Of course, there are things that are sort of intermediate, like Charlotte Christensen's H2 implementation in gasoline, where they sort of use a simplified rad transfer. They have the chemical network and simplified dust modeling. But my point is, I think it is not just for these cosmological hydrosims that we need to think about how to do this. And so for now, we're stuck with post-processing. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take the output from illustrious TNG and try to figure out how much H1 and H2 there is after the fact. How might we hope to model that? One thing people have done is you assume some sort of simple geometry for the GMCs, like a sphere or a slab that is illuminated by UV light, and then you get exactly what I said. You get an H1 layer on the outside, H2 on the inside. So Mark Krumholz, for example, has been prominent in writing down models like this. And I would say this is actually fairly well understood physically. But of course, now we have models for an individual cloud, and what we need is to average over a large volume, many clouds. So there will be fudge factors. And for that reason, you might say, can we really trust this? So how about we find some more other ways to constrain the molecular gas? For example, it is well known that the molecular fraction correlates with something called the midplane pressure. It's this observationally defined quantity that is mostly surface densities and velocity dispersions. You get a nice correlation. This was measured in the local universe, so it's not totally clear that this will hold everywhere. But at least it is something that from our simulation we can predict in the sense that this was already averaged on larger scales, like something we can do in illustrious. The third way we could constrain H2 is Well, some people have run these very intricate simulations where they have a UV radiation field and they can compute H1 and H2. And then they can average the results on some larger scale, like half a kiloparsec, and give you a fitting function, H2 fraction, as a function of, say, UV field, surface density, and metallicity. So armed with these three different ways of modeling H2, people have already gone out, especially for the Eagle simulations, and done this. So for example, this plot is from Yannick Bahay's paper where he's showing the density profiles of H1 disks. Beautiful plot, green is the simulation, black are the observations, matches perfectly. The only problem is there is a second panel to this plot, which shows the exact same thing, except that the green line now was computed using a different model for the H2. Suddenly we have H1 holes, nothing matches, it's pretty bad. Right? So this plot tells me that I know nothing. It means we can't really say if the simulation matches or not. And this sort of disagreement has been kind of endemic in the very young literature on this topic. So in many cases, people have used different models, found they don't quite agree, or things don't agree between papers. So when I say things like this, I don't want that to be understood as a criticism of any of these papers. This field is extremely young, and we're going through some growing pains here. But I think one way in which we wanted to improve on the situation was definitely to use all the available models, put them on the same footing, and do a systematic comparison. So I actually used 5 different models. I'm only going to show you 3, but it doesn't matter. So let's see how we are going to compute the H2 fraction. I pulled, as an example, one spiral galaxy from TNG. We have it in stars, gas density, temperature, star formation rate, and the neutral fraction. So this neutral fraction, that is computed by the simulation. And we're not going to go into how or why, because that's a whole different talk. We're just going to accept that Illustris gives us the fraction of neutral hydrogen, and we're going to try to split that into atomic and molecular. We're going to start doing that the way people have been doing it, which is cell by cell. So you go into the simulation, you look at each individual gas cell, and you try to compute this FH2, this molecular fraction for each cell. Let's start, for example, with this observational correlation. So this midplane pressure we don't really have for each cell, so what people have been doing is, well, let's just use the thermal pressure. Chuck that into this formula, see what happens. In this case, we get no H2, almost. That's weird. But okay, let's press on. For the next models, we need UV. So we need to somehow come up with a guesstimate of our UV field. What people have been doing so far is they've taken the SFR and said, well, you know, UV comes from young stars. So we can just locally estimate it as being proportional to the SFR. Problem is, of course, if you have a cell that sits right here, produces no stars itself, but is right next to these star-forming regions, you would say it gets no UV, and that's clearly nonsense. So what I did is at least I implemented optically thin UV transfer. So the idea being you have this UV light being born in stars, and then there is some escape fraction. And what that is, that's a whole different question. And then the rest sort of propagates optically thinly. Of course, in reality, some of this light would be absorbed. This is a very, very crude approximation. But I think it's better than just assuming this map. Now this escape fraction, of course, we can sort of crank it up and we just get more UV. This number is extremely unknown. It really could be sort of between 0 and 1. Nobody can tell me what it is. If you have a strong opinion, I want to hear it. I assume 10%. I think there are arguments why that is not totally unrealistic. But most importantly, one can show that it's not, I mean, it influences the results, but it's not a total killer. You know, it doesn't mean that we can't say anything. 10%. Oh, sorry. It's the fraction of escape fraction. So you produce, you know how much UV you produce from a given star formation rate from something like, you know, this, whatever stellar code. Yeah, sorry. That is Lyman-Werner. So I only care about Lyman-Werner. That's a good question. So for ionizing photons, this whole thing would be totally wrong, because there you really cannot do anything in optically thin regime because everything gets absorbed immediately. But again, this is very crude. I really don't mean to say that this is anything like RT. So now with our new UV field, we can now compute the predictions from Nick Nedden's simulation-based model, for example, or Mark Frumholz's analytical model. And the conclusion we immediately arrive at is that these 3 models do not agree. And they disagree by an order of magnitude. So this is already just very bad. Why do they not agree? We dug into this very deeply. It turns out that one of the biggest problems is how these quantities are computed. For example, when we have these cells, we have a volume density, but these models actually work in surface density. What do? People then assume the Jeans length, that is sort of the size of a gravitationally supported system, and multiply the volume density by that to get a surface density. And that just seemed really bad to me. So it turns out we show explicitly that this doesn't really work all that well. This is the cell-by-cell modeling. So we also did projected modeling, where we just rotate the galaxies face on, project down, use the actual surface quantity. And then we can do things like compute this P effective like observers computed properly. Lo and behold, totally different from the thermal pressure, right? So you already know this is just nonsense. As soon as you do that, you actually get reasonable results. But, these 5 different remaining models, they agree sort of-ish, but it's still not great. And that is basically, that's not just for this one galaxy, this turns out to be true in general. So on average, the statements that we can make are relatively robust. But galaxy to galaxy, it gets pretty dicey. Here's a more quantitative way to say that. So I'm plotting something similar to what Ruben just showed, which is the gas fraction, so H1 mass over stellar mass and H2 mass over stellar. Each line is one of these models. The blue and pink are the 100 megaparsec TNG box. The yellowish ones are the 300, so there's already a convergence issue. That is a whole different question. But most importantly, these models actually now agree reasonably well. That's good. Especially the projected and cell-by-cell actually sort of agree. And then this agreement translates into even better agreement for H1 because there's more H1 than H2. So now we can do what we've been sort of meaning to do, which is put some observations on this plot, but this is extremely preliminary because I haven't massaged the simulation data at all yet. I haven't taken into account apertures and detection limits and all this good stuff. So please don't take this seriously. It's just sort of an order of magnitude plot, but it looks like Illustris is perfectly reasonable, at least in these quantities. Same for mass functions. Here's the alfalfa H1 mass function exquisitely measured and looks pretty compatible. H2 is harder to measure, as we've already heard, because this nasty CO to H2 conversion needs to be taken into account. But again, very preliminary. Please don't hold me to any of these. They could totally change. In the near future, we're going to do these comparisons properly, and you'll hear about that on the archive. Of course, the goal is to, now with this data, we can go and compare to a whole wealth of data. Right? ALMA will give us higher redshift H2, the things that Ruben just showed, beautiful data to compare to. For now, all I want you to take away from this is that modeling the H1 to H2 transition is really difficult. And it's difficult for 2 reasons. Difficult because we don't have the resolution to get down to the level where all of this physics happens, and it's difficult because the physics itself is just complicated. We've improved on the situation in 3 ways, I think. Namely, we've done a systematic comparison that cleared up a lot of the confusion around these different models. We've tried to do a bit better on the UV field, and we've introduced this projected modeling that takes out this crazy conversion from volume to surface densities. With these improvements, the modeling is sort of reasonably robust on average, but I wouldn't really trust it galaxy to galaxy. There's still big scatter. And I guess this takes us back to the question I asked in the very beginning. Are these Cosmos sims ready for this type of analysis? And the answer is, honestly, I don't know. I mean, I think it is a little crazy what we're doing. But again, some people will do it, and so we might as well do it as well as we can. Thanks.
Questions? Yep, Kevin.
So if you can get to H2, then you have a new way to predict star formation rates, or a different way. Is that an interesting direction to pursue?
Yes. So what we can actually plot is the Benedikt-Schmidt relation, right? Because the H2 was not taken into account in star formation when computing the simulation. And so now this is actually a sanity check, basically, right? And it sort of looks reasonable for H1. For H2, you can kind of see that the Benedikt-Schmidt relation that Sandy just showed is actually not obeyed, right? So the relation has a constant depletion time in observations, but in simulations it remains steep because basically at these high densities, everything is H2. And what was put into Illustris was the can you catch mid-polar with a slope of 1.5? So you sort of get out what you put in there. This is a good example of a plot that you have to be extremely careful in interpreting.
So what's the most interesting part where if you make these comparisons with the gas, you're really constraining on certain things in the model?
Yeah, I think, great question. I think we have sort of fulfilled most of the stellar requirements. Right? So now it would be really interesting to see if the gas is sort of in the right place at the right time. So for example, I would love to see some higher redshift observations of H2. Now, are we forming stars for the right reason at the right time? ALMA, for example, would be great for that. One thing I'm excited about, a plot I have not really made yet, is the H1 size-mass relation. For example, the disks, they all look pretty big to me, but I think it's overall, statistically speaking, okay. But yeah, those are ways in which, I mean, I'm hoping to break sort of the illustrious model, right? I think it's gotten so good that we need to break it again to learn something interesting.
Questions? I go behind there.
Hi. So you're doing like H1 to H2 transition. So basically, are you doing comparison? Your comparison is limited to low Z, or are you interested in seeing the redshift evolution? Because for high Z, it's much harder to get H1 constraints.
That's right. So for
Yes.
it's a weird situation, right? For low Z, we can basically get both. And for high Z, actually, sort of ironically, the H2 will actually be easier to see, even though there is much less of it.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, while we'll compare to any observations we can get, right? And any observations that we think we can, model from the simulation with any reasonable fidelity.
Yeah. And also when you compare the data to observation, do you use observation like using different method to constrain H2 mass? Because some different studies might just assume a different XCO factor, and also some study doesn't use CO but sub-millimeter flux or C1 even to constrain H2.
I mean, this is exactly why I said that these plots were extremely preliminary, because I haven't really started. I'm only just now started to work on this. And
Okay.
so we should talk. I guess you sound like you have some good input for what we need to watch out for.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's thank the speaker again.